Hello, and welcome to the Lincoln Institute Dialogue on Tackling Climate Change with Land Policy. These Lincoln Institute Dialogues are part of our 75th anniversary celebration, where we're showcasing the work of the Lincoln Institute during 2021, our anniversary year. We're featuring prominent guests who are engaged in addressing challenges across the globe and areas that are of concern to the Lincoln Institute. They offer an opportunity for us to explore more deeply the role of land policy in advancing solutions and producing change for the benefit of people and place. Additional Lincoln Institute dialogues will be held every 6 weeks, beginning in September through the fall. Sign up for our emails and check out the 75th anniversary section of our webpage to stay on top of the most current information. In this, our first dialogue, I'm really pleased to be joined by Michelle Manion from Mass Audubon and Sivan Kartha of the Stockholm Environment Institute. We're going to talk about climate change, the role land policy plays, and the role it could play in global efforts to tackle climate change. Let me begin by just giving us a bit of a foundation. When you begin thinking about climate change, you quickly begin thinking about carbon. Now, yeah, carbon in and on land is a good thing. It's a foundation of life. But in the atmosphere, it's a bad thing and compromises our natural systems in ways that we'll discuss. The most significant way that humans emit carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases is through carbon dioxide. Some of these other gases are related to fossil fuel infrastructure, and some of them are more potent than carbon dioxide, but their potency is always expressed in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. And the most significant source of carbon dioxide is the burning of fossil fuels. Now, if you look at the global source of greenhouse gases, first of all, there's a lot of information here, but you can see quite quickly why we talk about the role of land policy in influencing emissions of greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's energy use in buildings and in transport, industries, to the deforestation of our forests and the use of our agricultural lands. These are all ways in which we can think of land as hindering or helping our efforts to moderate the degree of climate change that occurs and help us adapt to it. Now, we do talk about mitigation of climate change. When we do that, we're referring to reducing the burning of fossil fuels and the emission of greenhouse gases to try to slow or even stop the change that's occurring. When we make changes to accommodate the inevitable degree of climate change that is occurring, we call that adapting. And when we take steps to build our resilience in both physical environment and socially, we're preparing ourselves to better withstand and bounce back from climate-related shocks and stressors. So you'll hear us using mitigation, adaptation, and resilience through today's discussion. And I want to start, Michelle, by asking you if you could share your thoughts. I know we have a few slides on the ways in which the climate is changing and what it will take to address that.
Sure, happy to, Amy. If you can advance to the next slide. And I want to point out that this is very much just one depiction of the climate system and our current emissions trajectory. There's a ton of modeling that goes on every year by IPCC modelers and many others who are looking at all of the fossil fuel using sectors as well as the land sector. But the basic kind of configuration here is the same, which is that in the dark blue, we've got current emissions and historical emissions up through 2020, running over 40 gigatons per year. And then we have a depiction of an emissions trajectory to meet a 1.5 C by 2050 limit on warming, which implies at least 20 gigatons, but even more than that, lower than that by 2030. And to really get to what we're calling net zero assumes some residual emissions from fossil fuels, which means that we might not be able to develop technologies to mitigate all of those fossil fuel emissions, and or we just can't get that penetration everywhere, and that we'll have some residual fossil fuel emissions, which means we need to remove carbon from the atmosphere through land, and also certainly other strategies under development like direct air capture, carbon capture and storage combined with natural gas, for example. But essentially, we need very, very rapid reductions. And people are often talking about this as the critical decade for climate. And this really shows why that first sort of very deep decline in emissions out to 2030 requires an incredible scaling up of some of the technologies that we have in place right now, like renewable energy, air source heat pumps, and a lot of other things that are currently under development and hopefully will be ready for deployment thereafter. But it's really that red area that we're focusing in on today, because in addition to reducing the emissions from the land sector, that comes through deforestation, it comes from agricultural methane, agricultural nitrous oxides, and really loss of carbon from coastal and terrestrial ecosystems. We need to reverse that trend, but also enhance the carbon removal from the land sector in order to get to that net zero trajectory of 1.5 or well below 2C.
Mm-hmm. Next slide.
Yes, please. So I think very importantly, many of you probably saw the International Energy Agency, which historically has taken a pretty bearish view on things like renewable energy technology, have done projections that have very consistently under-predicted the amount of clean energy we've actually seen deployed, with strong policy drivers from places like California, Germany, China, and so forth. And they just came out with a fairly landmark report in the middle of May that I definitely point folks to, because they really have done almost a 180 in terms of their depiction of the role of the fossil fuel sectors in terms of meeting that sort of net zero goal. And essentially what they're saying is we simply cannot deploy any new coal plants at all anywhere on the globe. And we really need to slow very significantly the development of additional natural gas reserves. With really by 2025, stop selling any fossil fuel technologies for heating and cooling, quadrupling the current levels of solar and wind deployment. And then by 2035, cessation of any new internal combustion vehicles, as well as electrification of the heavy duty vehicles. And then really those tougher to abate sectors such as air travel, shipping, and some heavy duty transport, really having alternative fuels such as green hydrogen or some sustainable biofuels. And that's really a landmark change in the way that IEA has been depicting the role of fossil fuels. So that's a really, really important point. I think in thinking about what's the responsibility of both the fossil fuel energy sectors as well as the land sector, it's really shifted from being either or in terms of how people think about getting to that net zero to, I think we need both very significant reductions in fossil fuel emissions as well as a really big improvement in the role of the land sector in terms of the current trend.
Sivan, you look like you agree with this assessment.
Oh, do I? Yeah, I really do. I think this is an incredibly important point. I think earlier in sort of the development of climate policy and thinking through what is our portfolio of options, we used to think about there being a range of options, and let's think about sort of cost optimizing. Let's think about what are the cheapest ways. And land in many ways seemed to be among the cheapest ways. And the list of things that Michelle shows us here needs to be done on the energy side has been seen as really daunting. Something that would need to happen really fast, and something that would be really expensive, and something that there is a wide range of constituents who aren't necessarily in favor of rapidly doing these things. And so the thought of, well, let's just do more on the land side. It's always been really popular idea. And that's one reason why we have offset programs and things like that. Instead of doing it here, let's do it here. And I'd kind of like to double down on Michelle's point that it's really both and that it's in fact really kind of a trap even to think that we can do more on the land side and slow down efforts on the fossil side. If you look at the various scenarios that that modelers have done, looking at how could things play out, different rates of doing things on the fossil side and doing more on the land side. And some of those models have suggested, we could really slow down things on the fossil side. We could do things, a lot more on the land side. But if you look at the details of those models, and in particular, if you look at the simplicity of the land modeling that's done, you'll see that some of the assumptions made on how much we could scale up land get kind of absurd.
Mm.
And for example, looking at a range of pathways that models have come up with for keeping warming below 1.5 degrees, as the Paris Agreement has become a common global political affirmation of, the average is about 800 gigatons, billion tons of carbon would be sequestered across these models.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually more than the amount of carbon that over the course of 200 years of human population expansion and settlement expansion and agricultural expansion and deforestation, that's more than we've taken off the land. That's more than has been admitted. So it's just not clear whether it's even biophysically possible to put that much on. So just to kind of emphasize the point that it's both and we have to be really thoughtful about how we use land.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it might be helpful, Amy, to go to the next slide that kind of gets to this point about what is the potential for land in this whole equation of getting from that 40 plus gigatons down to net zero within this half century. And again, I'll emphasize this is just one depiction. This one's from McKinsey and the World Economic Forum. There have been a lot of other recent estimates. I point folks to the Food and Land Use Coalition work on really looking at the fact that, we don't only care about land because of its carbon removal capabilities. We use land to grow food for the growing global population. So we've got a lot of competition for that land and how we use it. But looking at the various approaches to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from land, the range I've seen is between 5 and 12 gigatons on an annual basis of net emissions removal. Somewhere, but we could get to that level by around 2030, and that includes, that very second pillar to the left there is showing avoided deforestation and reduction of emissions from peatlands.
Mm-hmm.
And they've done, the analysts here have tried to really look at what's practical from an economic standpoint. So they've taken into account some of those, what we call opportunity costs of, using land for agriculture and development and other things to really get to that 3.6 number out of that total of 7. And then really avoiding some of the damaging of some of the coastal ecosystems like mangroves, which we know are incredibly important stores of carbon, but also really important for habitat. Restoring peatlands, reforestation, and restoration of existing ecosystems is incredibly important. And then there are a lot of agricultural strategies to reduce emissions of carbon from soils, for example, and a variety of other strategies. So this is just, again, one depiction. This is really looking at around over half of the emission reductions coming from avoiding of continued deforestation and about 40% coming from restoration.
Mm-hmm. That's very helpful. Could you do me and perhaps others a favor of telling us what NCS stands for?
So NCS is Natural Climate Solutions, and that's essentially a way of describing this role for land within the mitigation part of the climate challenge. And as you pointed out earlier, Amy, we also care very much about being resilient and adapting to climate change. And so you'll hear the term nature-based solutions for creating resilience to climate change through the use of land and enhancing our existing ecosystems for reducing extreme heat impacts, improving our resilience to extreme flooding, and so forth.
That's very helpful. Would you, I'm going to stop sharing now if you think we're finished with this slide. I think that we commonly think about land and managing land for climate in terms of managing our forests, managing the carbon storage potential that is embodied in land. But what about, what do we sacrifice when we choose to cultivate land as agricultural land? And what should we do as we think about management of agricultural land? And then as we move into more populated areas, how should we think about urbanized areas as being places we can manage for climate?
I'll pitch in here first, Sivan, if that's okay. I mean, on the agricultural side, this has really garnered a lot more attention recently, because if you do look at the potential growth in population over the next, decades, we could be looking at, well north of 9 billion people. And feeding all those people is going to require a significant increase in overall productivity. And, there's a whole new set of strategies when we think about agriculture, such as reducing the amount of food loss and waste, which are really truly climate solutions, which, we want to do for a whole variety of other reasons. But increasingly, people have really started to think a little bit beyond the traditional box of reducing emissions on farm to looking at the whole system. And if we can reduce the amount of food loss and waste, which in the United States is mostly post-consumer, but it's up to 50% of overall food when you think about that. And you think about the potential there, that's good for a whole bunch of economic reasons. There's a pretty expansive set of solutions that we can be working on to reduce the agricultural component of the emissions picture.
Sivan, do you have some thoughts along those lines?
Absolutely. And then, as you said, Amy, land, when we think of it kind of broadly in terms of, what does land policy relate to and affect? There's, sort of natural landscapes and agricultural landscapes and land conservation and such. But as you point out, there's also land use planning and zoning and infrastructure related decisions and sort of urban design related decisions. And these affect climate and greenhouse gas emissions, not only through the carbon sequestration potential of green areas, but also how they affect our transportation needs and how compact or sprawling our human settlement expansion is, and the type of buildings we use and how efficient they are, and the modes of transportation we use. So land policy ends up affecting a lot of what we think of as climate policy. And that was just on the mitigation side. On the adaptation side, as has been alluded to, just as much so, whether it's about preserving watersheds and floodplain protection, or reducing urban heat island effects, or a range of ways in which resiliency is affected or determined by what type of land policy we use.
I mean, as an urban planner by training and inclination, I think about ways that we can manage cities to not only obtain the efficiencies that come with living more compactly, not on top of each other, not in a crowded fashion, but in a fashion that actually gives us the vibrant streetscapes and way of life that we think of when we think about our favorite cities and neighborhoods. And that those not only help us reduce our carbon footprint, so to speak, on the mitigation side, but help build the kind of, again, that vibrancy also reflects social connections that give us a level of social resilience, if not physical resilience, which we need to build into those systems as well. And I'm also very interested in supporting my colleagues on our land conservation unit, who are focused very much on preserving our natural landscapes. Well, let's keep cities out of the way so that we can preserve natural systems outside. I also wonder about the Back to that agricultural side of things, where in some ways the natural systems meet the human need for sustenance. And I see lots of opportunities for us to ensure that we don't have food loss in transportation to urban centers, making sure that the agricultural sources are close to our urban centers. But I also wonder if you've got some thoughts about how we manage those lands, considering the projections of the decline in their yield as the climate inevitably changes and their role in carbon storage. What should we think of as we think about farmland?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Amy, you're onto a really good point there. There's been a lot of modeling about, how growing seasons are going to shift under climate, and still quite a bit of uncertainty there, of course. Here in New England, we may actually have longer growing seasons, whereas other parts of the world, you're seeing some drying and droughts that are so extreme and so extended that agriculture may no longer be a viable activity in some parts of the world. So sort of trying to think about how to prepare ourselves for those shifts. And a lot of people are working on things like, changes to seed varieties. And certainly there's been a lot of work on soil carbon, and a lot of folks who are working on how to better measure soil carbon, but pretty wide agreement, in spite of the uncertainties in some of the measurement and trying to track it over time in a really precise way, is that we can definitely affect soil carbon through better practices. And there's a lot of experimentation and quite a few federal and state programs here in the US targeting better management practices for soil carbon. So that's a pretty promising area, I think.
Can I add into that?
Please.
I think that's incredibly important, in part because what happens to soil carbon as the climate warms is in many ways uncertain. The warming temperatures and greater rates of respiration and changes in soil microfauna, microflora mean that we don't really know what will happen to the carbon retention rates of soil. And it's just so indicative of climate change generally. There are, we can do the best we can to predict the temperature rise, but the impacts on an incredibly complicated global ecosystem of those temperature rises really is something that we are struggling to understand. And its effect on things like food production. Michelle, you mentioned that ranges and growing seasons are going to change. And the interaction of that with changes in precipitation patterns and with soil fertility, and with the other species that are kind of inextricably linked to our agricultural systems, like pollinating bees and such. That's all very difficult to predict, and in some cases, extremely large things are at stake. About a sixth of the world's population relies on the Asian monsoon for its agriculture. And we really don't want to mess with the Asian monsoon.
Yeah.
That's something on which humanity depends. We tend to forget that human civilization evolved during a kind of bizarre period after the last glacial maximum, when temperatures hovered within a range of a degree or so for 10,000 years, 15,000 years. And we can't assume that if we allow ourselves to kind of wander out of that range, that the planet will remain hospitable to human civilization. So the idea of building in resilience is necessary, and doing the best we can to understand the inevitable impacts is necessary. But we absolutely can't substitute that for a really earnest effort to keep the level of warming and the extent of those impacts absolutely, minimal.
So we talk about saving the planet, but really the planet's going to be here. It's just humanity may not be.
Yes.
Yes.
As Kafka said, there is hope, but not for us.
Oh dear.
We're not all Kafkas, though.
Let's try to find some bright linings in this conversation. Although I think we're being very honest about the challenges that we face, and I am personally excited at the potential for land policy to be a factor that could contribute to the resolution, or at least to positively addressing some of these issues. I want to just take a minute to acknowledge that some questions have been coming in. I think some of them have been addressed as we go. We intend to leave a significant time at the end to really engage with folks on these questions, so keep them coming. And we're going to move forward and ensure that we have that time at the end. I do want to raise the question, you know, we've already talked about food security, species decline. When we think about what when society can do with a given hectare of land, you know, we're in a global trend of rapid urbanization. Those expanding population centers need land for settlement, for food, for cultural pursuits, for lack of a better word right now. How do we balance those different demands on land, all of which seem to be increasing? And should we choose climate as the primary concern when we're thinking about how to use a particular tract of land?
It's a great question, Amy. I mean, I think in terms of bright spots that I'm seeing after we've managed to depress everyone, I think that there is a very great sort of revival in thinking about the full system of not just climate, but biodiversity and nature and everything else that nature provides. You know, like with most problems, we try to sort of boil them down to their basics so that we can tackle them a little bit better. So, you know, kind of putting climate in its own silo as separate and distinct from nature and biodiversity. You know, there's just a report that came out talking about how we need to relink these two spheres. And it's to our detriment if we really try to address them separately. So trying to sort of optimize land for carbon without thinking about all of the other things that land is so important for: biodiversity, habitat, agriculture, settlements, all of these, you know, reduction of climate impacts. And, you know, another place where we're seeing this is in the Amazon, where, you know, you have 50% of the world's rainforest, but we're starting to see incredible drops in humidity with increased deforestation, which is going to affect the ability of the entire region and perhaps beyond Latin America in terms of agricultural production. So, you know, that's another key linkage between climate and other natural systems and other reasons that we use land and need land to be sustained at its current pace. But I think the biodiversity piece is one that we focus on intently and really are increasingly looking for policy instruments that bring these two things together in a really integrated way.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. I'm really glad to hear you're seeing the silos being broken down and alignment in those efforts being found. Is the same thing occurring when it comes to the increasing poverty and inequality that's often manifest spatially across the globe? Or is that another silo that we need to first see and then break down?
I'd say that this is an active topic. It's an area of contestation, and there are various voices weighing in. And that's both on the kind of urban side and on the agricultural, natural, large area side. Mm-hmm. With regard to the large area side, there's more very interesting work being done on things like how can preservation and protection of human rights be integrated with ideas of protecting land for multiple uses, for as important carbon stocks, as important natural habitat, as sources of biodiversity rich ecosystems. So for example, there's more attention being paid now to the ways that indigenous communities interact with their own their own ecosystems, and the ways that they have historically been very effective at helping to preserve biodiversity and natural carbon stocks, and that there are means of sort of strengthening their land tenure, sort of recognition of their land tenure rights, in ways that help them kind of continue in a role of protecting these lands and the resources they provide. There are also there's much more work being done now in agroecology or regenerative agriculture, where agriculture based not just on maximizing yields, to the without regard to the amount and type of inputs and the other ecological impacts that arise from agriculture and industrial agriculture in particular. These alternative modes of agriculture production and the food systems around it, and the way that it helps to strengthen food security. That's another area in which a lot of work is now being done. That's not to say that we're still, there's still a lot of support for kind of climate focused, carbon maximizing ways of dealing with land and climate policy. For example, one way that one challenge that's been there for a while and is really an important challenge is just providing enough finance to deal with land related issues. And one solution that's seen to that has been various types of carbon markets, whether it's offsets or others. And the challenge that presents is that the markets provide a demand for one particular value of land, which is the carbon. And so creating markets that manage to balance the carbon demand with all the other demands, food and biodiversity and watershed protection, and that is an unsolved problem. And there are many examples that we've seen of ways in which market-based systems can end up, perhaps at least in the short term, at least based on the terms of that market itself, provide some carbon benefit. It has done so while compromising other land-related needs. And so this is a challenge that we're still working to figure out.
And I'm going to be the economist here, Sivan, and weigh in and say that there are folks that are working on this. Nature for Climate is a group that is really looking at building directly in, and I think have come up with some pretty effective definitions, Sivan, of what kind of co-benefits really should accompany any kind of carbon put forward in the marketplace. And as you know, we don't have sort of an agreed upon global agreement on what this should look like. But there have been a lot of folks who've been spending time trying to figure out, how do we differentiate just carbon from a monoculture plantation that has cleared natural forest to avoid that outcome, and to really put value onto the biodiversity impacts, as well as impacts on local indigenous communities and other local ecosystem and economic benefits for the local community. So that's evolved quite a bit. Whether it's there yet or not, that sort of remains to be seen, and a lot of debate going on this year in particular, coming up to the Conference of the Parties in December in Glasgow, to really figure out if this can fly at a global level or not. But right now we're still in a position where this is still voluntary. It's a voluntary marketplace for the most part, with some very notable exceptions. So I think that's, it's still a very fluid playing field, but there has been some progress.
There's some related questions that have come in the Q&A. Let me pull some of those in now. How effective are land use regulations in reducing carbon emissions as opposed to those markets? And is it politically feasible to influence carbon through land use regulations? What best practices exist? Can you talk about the role of regulation?
Sure, we could do a whole other session on this, right?
We've got questions stacked up, but yes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to my mind, this is the big missing piece that we have right now, right? Which is that nature is worth more dead than alive in many jurisdictions and contexts. And so, you know, we do need stronger policy drivers. I mean, we've seen these policy drivers work on the fossil fuel side. If you look at the numbers in terms of renewable energy deployment and how they've really started to scale in the last 10 years, behind that was very strong policy coming out of places like Germany and California and China on renewable policy that have driven those costs down. Then you see more deployment and the costs come down even further and you get a real learning curve. And so that policy driver on the land side, I mean, we do have exemplars like the Clean Water Act in the early 70s, really to stem the loss of wetlands, which we lost about 50% of in the United States. Under Section 404, you know, you can't destroy a wetland anymore because of its value. So that's your sort of starting point. And then there have been some market-based solutions layering on top of that regulation in terms of mitigation banking to preserve, you know, the ecosystem function where on those instances where wetlands are allowed to be developed. So it's, to me, it's not either or regulation and or market-based. I mean, market-based can be a part of a regulatory system.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's an important distinction to make there.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an important point, that all markets are markets that are designed markets. There's no such thing as sort of the, you know, the state of nature market. And so how we design those markets will have a lot to do with what they are meant to value.
Mm-hmm.
But then beyond markets, there are a whole range of ways that have been proven to be effective at preserving not only carbon but also other ecosystem benefits. So just the whole taxonomy of policies relating to land conservation has proven very effective. It's effective, I mean, in large part to the degree that it's implemented. And there are many places where, you know, land is by definition part of a land market, and conservation isn't built in. But to the extent that that land is taken out of land markets and protected through conservation, it can be extremely effective.
Mm-hmm.
One means of protection are sort of ecosystem and ecosystem service related protections like wetland protection or biodiversity hotspot protection, you know, national parks and such, but also protection and scheduling of indigenous lands, because indigenous lands are among the most carbon rich on the planet, and the range of regulations having to do with things like land tenure and customary land usage relating to that can be helpful. There's also a lot relating to, we can call it policy, but not necessarily regulations, having to do with public expenditure and what type of infrastructure we invest in. If we invest in, you know, roads cutting through major forest areas, those roads make the lands more accessible, and much of the sort of secondary expansion to those lands happens because of public infrastructure. Another point worth making is that, and Michelle, I think you mentioned that South America is one of the areas of growing fossil fuel development, and that development and the pipelines it comes with and the access roads it comes with has historically been one of the routes by which these forest areas are opened up and made more accessible, and then deforestation rates increase. So the way that public policy is used to support different types of infrastructure it's just a really important determinant of how these lands end up getting used.
I mean, one of the reasons I became a planner is this understanding that the extension of infrastructure invites development to follow. And so planning with those other objectives and an understanding of what we need to preserve where in mind is at the heart of what I do and what I advocate for. I want to talk a little bit about the upcoming Conference of Parties. Michelle mentioned in Glasgow, that's the climate COP. There's also the biodiversity COP coming up in China sooner, I think, than the Glasgow COP. My understanding is better on the climate side that the agreements that have been made are not, they're not countries, states, the parties are not held accountable to their commitments. And I wonder, we talked a little bit about the roles of markets and the roles of regulation. We had a question about the effectiveness and the political will behind regulation. What do you think the opportunity is to strengthen the commitments that are made, whether it's through those international agreements or whether it's in other contexts? And is that particularly, is that an option we should consider related to land policy, or is that particularly fraught when it comes to land policy?
I think everything with land when it comes to the Conference of the Parties and in the global situation has been pretty fraught. A lot of debate, a lot of experimentation. I mean, I personally see a lot of the subnational, provincial, state governments having a role for experimentation here. Mm-hmm. California's been a real leader in terms of overall climate policy, but also trying to figure out approaches to fitting land within a regulatory system as opposed to a voluntary system, primarily through an offsets-based approach. But I think increasingly, governments are trying to figure out really how to deliver the full package with the potential for land. So climate mitigation, but also climate resilience and natural infrastructure, as well as habitat and all the other attributes of nature. So I think there's a real expansiveness and an appetite for some experimentation and on policy that then could be scaled up to the international level. But there is a real difference too, as Sivan's really drawn the contrast between some of the developing country contexts and in some of the northern areas where we don't have the same rates of deforestation or the same sort of underlying conditions driving deforestation, but we do have, here in Massachusetts, which is not growing in terms of population very much, we still lose 5,000 acres a year to land use change. So, there's this sort of steady trend, and to really reverse that and build on the climate piece, we need to do some experimentation to bring some of that finance in. I think a key point is, the public sector and public money is a big part of it, but we've got to leverage private finance and figure out how to induce some of that private sector investment that we've seen deployed so successfully in the clean energy sector. We need to get that working on the land side.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to underscore Michelle's point that the very design of Paris, where we no longer have sort of a regime where countries are intended to come together on an international negotiating stage and sort of set targets that are consistent with our global objectives. It's a voluntary system now, and countries put forward pledges and they say, we'll try and meet them. And then we come back and every 5 years to see, how well they were met. And in that context, the feedback between smaller scale experimentation, whether it's individual countries or states or cities, and the global scale becomes really important. And the seeding of that experimentation and the process by which the feedback happens, and then the establishment of best practices, as global examples, that becomes really important. Another part that I think is extremely important is the pace-setting power of leaders. Okay. There are some countries that are doing more than other pace-setting, and some countries that are doing much less than others. And in a situation like this, with a global challenge like this, where it really is a global commons problem, where no country can protect their own climate, and we're all relying on each other to do your part, countries look on this international stage at the other countries and see who's doing their part.
Mhm.
And for countries that have contributed the most to the problem historically, and who have the most financial and technological wherewithal to solve the problem, these countries really should be setting the pace.
Mhm.
There's no formal target and timeline setting process anymore, but this just means that it's up to these countries to rally what political will they can at home and show what leadership looks like, and invest where that experimentation and innovation needs to happen, and show that this alternate path of development is a viable path.
Mhm.
And lacking that, I think it becomes extremely challenging for developing countries that have really pressing and sometimes competing developmental needs, to kind of sway their policy attention and their investment resources into decarbonization, when expanding energy access or food access or water
Yeah.
access
Mhm.
might just feel more urgent. And
Mhm.
so setting that pace, showing what leadership looks like, showing what kind of innovation is needed, and showing that it works when implemented, that's the key. That's kind of all we have to rely on with Paris. And a part of that Paris kind of provides a framework for is explicit international support. Wealthier countries helping developing countries put in place good land policies, provide resources where it's needed, provide technical expertise, provide, remote sensing expertise, just the types of support, technological and financial, that are needed to make this. I mean, what Michelle showed at the beginning is really quite a rapid change
Mhm.
to make that actually feasible for them.
Yeah. Let me bring in a question from the Q&A. And it sort of, I wonder if you're starting to suggest an answer to this question, which is what are the most likely pathways to success? More regulation, reliance on markets. I think we've talked about neither alone being sufficient, but maybe there's another option. Is there another path? And is it, is it in that sort of information provision and technical assistance, if you will, on a global stage provision? What avenues, what pathways should we explore beyond regulation and market?
I have a thought on that. I think that a lot of pathways have been explored, have been, sort of probed and tried and tested, and we understand actually really well what the technological needs are and what is the portfolio of options. We've been talking about efficiency and renewables and that sort of thing forever. For the 30 years that we've had a climate treaty, we know what the range of policy options are. And we've gotten, we have pretty good, policy design um, 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 ideas on the table, and in some cases implemented. We know what types of support would be really helpful to provide. I think the pathway that is as yet still somewhat unexplored and in some ways almost taboo is the issue of where are the barriers in terms of which actors have a strong incentive not to see
Mm.
decarbonization to happen quickly and the end of deforestation happen quickly. And what sorts of political and economic influence do they have, and how can that be shifted? One example would be, say, over the last few years, the conversation about fossil fuel subsidies has really come to the fore. And the G7 countries have said, okay, we're going to stop fossil fuel subsidies. And that's a way of thinking about what are the barriers, who are the actors, the sort of the fossil fuel sector that has to benefit from our current development mode, and in a sense, kind of reducing their financial and political ability to determine countries' development pathways. So yeah, so I think it's taking a cold hard look at, in individual countries, what are those barriers, how can they be eliminated, and then doing what we kind of have known needs to be done.
I would just add on to that, in terms of the pathway, I think it's partly regulation and it's partly markets, but it's also increased consumer awareness and pressure on publicly traded corporations and the entire financial sector. And you're starting to see that happening with the publicly traded oil and gas companies, which have had to write down enormous losses in the tens of billions over the last couple of years. But the shareholder, through engine number one, a very small hedge fund that held very small percentage of ExxonMobil's rights, and the impact that they had in terms of getting other shareholders on board to change the seats of Exxon, to really look more forward on climate and the risks to the standing capital in oil and gas. So that's just one example. I think there's an enormous pent up, demand from consumers, especially those who are younger than we all are and facing a future that's already certainly being impacted by climate, and in terms of how they deploy their purchasing power and expand that voice. So I think the education piece, now that I think we have more or less fully negated the impact of the fossil fuel companies trying to influence the science and the media, I think we're a bit past that finally, but it took 20 plus years and now we have full awareness. And so I think that the role of the consumer, the educated consumer, is a really potent force that I think is just starting to be unleashed. I think a lot of the smart capital is starting to move away from fossil fuels, and you have some of the major commercial banks that are starting to not lend to coal. It should have happened sooner than it's happening, but it's a very good development that you start to see, financing of new coal in the United States is just not possible at this moment.
Yeah, I think this is incredibly important. I think, and picking up on one of the questions, I think another incredibly important development is the recognition of the ways that a climate transition, a decarbonization transition, has equity implications. And one of the ways in which that's true on sort of the national scale is a recognition of the ways in which our current energy system really was kind of built on the backs of marginalized communities, whether it's where the extraction is happening or the refining is happening, and a recognition of those equity considerations and a sort of a commitment and earnest policy and political investment in transitioning away from that. Not only can it help address those equity concerns, but it's also a way of building the political constituency and a broad enough political consensus for change that is going to be needed if we're going to actually make this change. I think that something that the climate community and the sort of climate policy focused people could increasingly take into account is the fact that there are various constituents that have either to benefit from a transition, or that could benefit from a transition but potentially be hurt if the transition is done in a way that's not so good. And the labor constituency is one of them. Take into account what would a transition look like that addressed the needs of workers whose livelihoods are currently bound to our current energy system. What would it mean to take that into account? What type of new jobs, good new jobs, that have collective bargaining rights and such, and have benefits? What would that look like? Simply casting people out from a from their, the dominant sector in their community, by shutting down that sector, it's not a way to win support for a climate transition.
Mhm. That's great. And fundamentally probably a little unfair. Let me, as our time amazingly draws close to an end, I wonder if I could ask you each to comment a little bit about the opportunity presented by the pandemic. And I frame it that way in an effort to help us identify those things that we may have adapted to quickly, that we could choose to retain, or the potential pitfalls that we need to be mindful of as we in the United States emerge, but certainly the global emergence from this pandemic is far off. How should we think about the state we find ourselves in, the opportunity it presents when it comes to climate?
I'll take this really quick, and I'll just make 3 really quick points. I think, first of all, the pandemic showed us we all have the capacity to change really quickly when we need to. I think that's really important. I think, second of all, the recovery packages that are being deployed, the opportunity to really build back better and start to make some of those investments in things that we know can, rebuild infrastructure, but do so using nature, for example, and redeploying more towards green rather than gray on the building back is a big opportunity. And then, of course, the patterns of how we work and how we travel. I think most employers are looking at reducing the amount of time we all commute, and there's a real impact there. I think we're just starting to understand how it could change long-term land use change.
Yes.
And land use change, as you know, is a long-term trend. So kind of early days to really come to a conclusion on that, but it could really, shift where we do our work and where we develop areas.
Yeah, if I may, on the land use side, it's clear that at least in the United States, and I assume in developed countries like the United States, commute trips are actually a minority of automobile trips that are taken, and therefore a minority of the emissions that we can attribute to the transport personal automobile sector. So, as people shift to working from home, and that if presumably a bit of a sticky trend or sticky habit that we've got, how do we avoid having the errands or the other trips that are not commute trips just explode and increase the transport sector emissions? And for me, that's a land use question. How do we make sure that the things people need are close at hand, so that automobile trips can be minimized, so that we can, foster those vibrant streetscapes that provide for resilience and avoid the need for automobile trips? So that's a land use planner's perspective on that particular trend.
Yeah.
Sivan, did you have anything to offer on the pandemic opportunity?
No, I think both those points are key. One thing I might say is, don't get distracted by the immediate short-term trends. Emissions dropped by some 17% within a month or so. It meant nothing. And by the end of the year, we had bounced back to, a few percent point. And by the end of this year, we're expected to be nearly back to where we were before. So don't get distracted by those. It's the long-term trends. It's how people feel about transit and how people feel about where they want to live, and whether it's in a, compact area. And then key thing that you just said, Amy, is that it's about the vibrancy of our communities and the attractiveness of our communities. And so it means that some of the most important things, as far as transport related emissions at least, aren't what we think of as climate policy.
Interesting.
And that it might be more about education policy. And so it's worth thinking about, is there such a thing as climate policy, or do we have development policy? And we need to think about how to make our development policy consistent with climate, as well as equity and other goals.
Well, and it all relates to land, at least in my mind. So thank you very much for helping us to think about some of these issues across different sectors, across different parts of the globe. I just want to invite you and everybody else to come back for the next Lincoln Institute Dialogue. Sign up for our email lists, visit our website. There's a 75th anniversary section that'll make you aware of all of the events that are occurring, hopefully in person in the near future. So thank you very much, Sivan Kartha, Michelle Manion. I look forward to continuing our conversation.
Thanks,
Thanks so
Amy.
much, Amy.
Thank you.